Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. In this one I want to give my thoughts on this recent post that the official Avatar social media channels put up. Build your team to defeat the Avatar. You have $5, and then they have a bunch of the villains here listed into tiers, money amounts, and you basically have to draft your team with the budget of 5 to defeat the Avatar. I thought it was an interesting concept, especially because a kind of interesting discussion has come up out of this about sort of how people view these characters, how people underrate some of these characters, overrate some of these characters, and in a way, people's unusual logic for they have to defeat an avatar and they're missing out on some very key ways to actually do that. So I did this previously. I think they did something similar with the Draft Your Pro bending team with a lot of the notable characters. So here is another version of that. So let's get into this here. So first of all, kind of very briefly, just taking a look at the tiers. So the lowest tier, $1, Hama, Vaatu, Unalaq, and Eska. So straight away here, I really feel that Unalaq being here means you are probably never going to choose Eska. It just feels like if you have one left, why are you choosing Eska over Unalaq? Desna isn't on here at all, so there's not even that, well, if you team up Eska and Desna, that's a nice combination. So unless you're going for the sort of father-daughter pairing, it kind of feels like, why wouldn't you just choose Unalaq over Eska? So really, there's only kind of 3 picks for me left. And then with Hama, her main thing is that she is a bloodbender, but a normal bloodbender. So unless this fight is happening during the full moon, it kind of feels like, okay, she is a notable waterbender, but I'm not choosing Hama over Unalaq if the bloodbending isn't really going to be on. So at the $1 tier, what it leaves is Vaatu and Unalaq. And it straight away is like, well, if you have one left over, how are you not throwing Vaatu into your team? And if you've already chosen Vaatu, how are you not also throwing Unalaq onto your team? Like, these are 2 really notable characters on this list. And it's interesting if you look at the comments and see sort of how a lot of the earlier comments were like just choosing basically some of your favorite villains. And it's a nice team, but it doesn't really feel like a good team to take down the Avatar. Whereas here's the duo that actually, in a way, took down the Avatar, and people are kind of ignoring them. Now, thankfully, other fans have come in the meantime as this has spread, and kind of there's been more of a sense of, like, say, the likes and stuff like that evening out for, like, hey, guys, you're sleeping on the fact that Vaatu basically facilitates you actually being able to face against the Avatar, and you have to consider that. So Vaatu is hugely underpriced. Like, he should be 100% in the $3 tier. I get it, like, we have seen examples that technically the Avatar, like Human and Rava, is more than a match for just Vaatu, the spirit. But it's still an even fight. It's like, oh wow, 10 power level versus 9 power level versus, say, people choosing like a Zula, and it's like 10 versus like an 8 or a 7 on those levels we're talking about here. The difference in sort of power level between Vaatu and someone else, like it is kind of really, really notable, if not just for the raw sort of like power source level that Vaatu actually is. And again, because he is so cheap, he is going to be teaming up with a bunch of other powerful benders and assisting them. So it's not just a one-on-one thing, which is often where the weakness of a giant kite-like spirit is. So that's important to factor in as well. So both Vaatu and I think Unalaq are hugely undercosted. Like, Vaatu should cost 2 more than he does, and I think Unalaq should be probably in the $2 tier if we're being realistic here. So it's fascinating that even at the cheap cost of these 2, people still have not, for the most part, gone for them. The $2 tier. So here, I've seen people argue that he should be in the $3 tier. I don't think so. His ability of flight is going to allow him, like, mobility to rival the Avatar in the Avatar state, which is notable. but I just don't think his raw airbending skills otherwise quite have the firepower to take out the Avatar unless you've built the rest of your team out to literally just facilitate locking down the Avatar to allow Zahir to like asphyxiate the Avatar. But I think there are better options on these lists with a character to go for to finish the fight than to rely on what is ultimately a, like, literally you have to lock the person in place to do that. And the setup that was actually required at the end of book 3 involved basically the rest of Zahir's team, because he fought an Avatar poisoned throughout that whole fight, and the Avatar state was not at its kind of top level, and it was using tactics that, you know, played into Zahir's hands. So I think the main thing with Zahir is just that you literally have a flying character, and there's only 2 flying characters on the list, Zahir and Vatu, but otherwise, like, I'm not sure. So I think it's fine. Zahir is actually placed well in the $2 tier. Who's not placed well, I think, is Zhao. Zhao definitely on this list should be 1. You can argue he probably should be replaced by someone else, but they're just going for the villains here. The problem realistically is that you are not choosing Zhao on your team. There are a few characters here that I just don't think anyone is going to go anywhere near. And I would probably say like Eska and Zhao are definitely 2 of them, because there are just better options throughout this. And because you're fighting the Avatar, like, I don't really see that there's that much like particular value in just making sure your team has like one of each element, just because in general the fights don't tend to particularly be this is weak against that kind of Pokemon style thing. There's always a balance to the elements, so even if you just have elements of all one benders of all of one element, I don't think that's that much of a problem. It's more about the tactics and just abilities that you have rather than specifically having as multiple elements, really. So Zhao should probably be 1, and at 2 you're never going to pick him. Long Feng is interesting, but I think he is outclassed in like every way by Kuvira. 1, metal bending. They both have sort of a, you know, that Dai Li kind of style of trapping people's limbs, locking them down a little bit. But Kuvira does that so much better. He is still interesting and notable because he's obviously meant to be, you know, the head of the Dai Li and on that level. But again, why are you going to choose Long Feng over like Zahir or especially Tarlok? Because you can make an argument that Tarlok, just because of bloodbending, should be probably priced at 3. But Amon should always be priced higher than Tarlok, but if there's only 3 tiers, I get why you're doing it here. What you're basically doing here is like comparing the idea of, do you want to pay the extra 1 to get Amon over Tarlok just because Amon is just net more powerful, has a stronger bloodbending grip, and can do psychic bloodbending, not just bloodbending without the full moon? And for me, I'm kind of like, yeah, but I will not undersell Tarlok at all. In that Tarlok probably demonstrates, at least based on what we see, the waterbending abilities of the family that we basically apply onto Amon, because we don't really see Amon waterbend that much. But Tarlok is very, very skilled. So at 2, I think he's actually probably the best value overall on the list, because at least for me in the fight against the Avatar, I would much more value the idea that he can bloodbend the Avatar and stop them in place, or at least be somewhat of a restriction or just a threat in the fight, because he has that ability to immediately bring you to a stop and at worst control you. And in a fight where it's going to be multiple people against one Avatar, that's very, very notable. Into the $3 tiers. Now, the interesting thing about this is if you go for someone with 3, you immediately kind of lock yourself out from kind of how many more characters you can have. So you obviously can't have 2 characters from this tier, you can only have 1. And in a way, like, how many of these characters stand out on their own enough to justify spending this much on them? So we got 2 firebenders here, Ozai and Azula, Kuvira as our earthbender / metalbender, and Amon. Obviously, naturally, I'm going to lean towards Amon because I just think that is a huge and immediate way to win the fight that we're going out for, by having one of the most powerful benders we've ever seen in the franchise with that ability, which is, again, one of the most powerful. Um, that just feels like exactly what you want. He's good at dodging, he's agile, because he also has that sort of non-bender fighting training as well. And he has obviously high-level waterbending powers, given that he comes from a powerful waterbending line that has the bloodbending ability. So Amon obviously is going to stand out, and it feels like, if you're not picking Vatu, then it feels like you almost have to have Amon in your team, is the way I'd go with it. If you're not choosing both of them, and then you don't choose Tarlok as well, then it sort of feels like all of a sudden you don't have the power, the raw power to really combat the Avatar in the Avatar state, unless you're coming up with like weird scenarios that we've never really seen play out or be shown to be particularly effective. So there's that. As for the firebenders, obviously the idea is that you're not going to pick Zhao, so Ozai or Azula at this high tier are your only options for firebenders. Now, obviously with Ozai you have an absolute powerhouse, the main kind of villain of one of the series, who's obviously going to have a really strong power level. He has lightning, of course. But then you have the prodigy of Azula with, like the blue fire. She has lightning, generation and redirection where she is right now. But you maybe just wonder about like, oh, this is going to be a battle that maybe is quite heavily about firepower. Would you go for maybe more of that kind of potential that Ozai seems to offer versus kind of where Azula is right now? It's an interesting one. I can maybe see on this fight, a special fight against the Avatar, maybe the utility of also having lightning redirection gives maybe Azula the slight edge. But because it again is a multiple benders against the Avatar fight, a redirection battle, someone's going to get involved in it if it gets into that. So I don't think that particularly rules Ozai out. And I think you do need ultimately a strong power level to basically... this fight, you're going to have to use gimmicks effectively to beat the Avatar if they go into the Avatar state. Otherwise, the only way to stay in is to have the net raw power to in any way fend off Avatar state attacks. And it feels kind of like Ozai is kind of one of the few characters in that kind of category, sort of. Even though most of his feats, of course, that we have are Sozin's Comet enhanced, it still feels like, he's kind of the guy that will, do something, if anything, against it. Now, obviously, the Ozai example is probably a good example of why you need a more than just him. You need much more than that. That it's not okay to just have one enhanced bender and that be it. Because even Ozai with the Comet fled, like literally had nothing to fight against the Avatar in the Avatar state. And I think that is a very telling example of you need unique benders, special abilities to face off against the Avatar. And this is the problem with all those people who went easy, Zahir Azula wins the fight, is that how do they defeat the Avatar state? Like, okay, Zahir can dodge for a while, but if the Avatar state doesn't do precisely what Korra Poisoned did in Book 3, he's not doing anything against the Avatar state. Azula with lightning at least offers you like an attack that is probably powerful enough to get through any sort of Avatar state defenses, but without being enhanced herself, she's going to have to rely on Zahir, like bringing her basically around the battlefield. But you are still 100% reliant on, in my mind, pretty much lightning to win the fight, and that's it. You could probably have lightning and then the suffocation stuff maybe to finish the Avatar off, but that is assuming they never get hit in the fight. And if Zahir is having to carry Azula around, I think that increases the likelihood that they do eventually get hit. And then again, Zahir's dodging was helped by weakening the Avatar state ahead of that fight. So that's sort of the problem with it. Like I said, leaving out Vatu, Tarlok, or Mon is that you suddenly force normal benders to have to oppose an Avatar in the Avatar state. And I get I'm very focused on this side of things, and that there are obviously options where like your team could potentially overwhelm the avatar before they go into the avatar state. But it's a defense mechanism. It's going to activate unless very specific conditions are met. So it feels like you have to be prepared for the second stage of this fight, which is the power level goes up. What can you do to oppose it? And like I said, if you don't have certain characters here, you're not talking about the same levels in these fights. And I think that's just what it comes down to. I don't like to go into the power scaling thing too much, but in Avatar and Korra, this franchise, the one thing that is blatantly apparent is that the Avatar state is a level above pretty much everything else. And the only things on this list that rival that are Vaatu, by virtue of basically having the potential with a human to also form an avatar-like being, and then the bloodbending ability of Tarlok and Amon, which is effectively the waterbender version of like lava and combustion bending, which is like it's kind of described effectively. Combustion bending in the Yang Chen books is described as effectively being avatar level abilities. That's what this is. Because if you have a bloodbender, you can start the fight off straight away by bloodbender takes control of the avatar. Sure, they theoretically can and likely will break out, but because it's not one-on-one, just locking the avatar down for even a couple of seconds probably wins you that fight straight off the bat, or at least gets you immediately into the avatar state version of the fight. So you've activated that with like one move. You're into the second stage of the fight, which then means that like, okay, can bloodbenders with just some other benders work on this to make it happen? I'm guessing this is where the power level is, again, a bit of a problem. Is that if the avatar state allows you to break out of bloodbending, I can't see any of the bloodbenders being able to apply it again. So the second that the avatar state activates, it does feel like the only thing on the list that is an opposition is Vaatu. Like, that it's the only thing that gives you the power. So to me, you have to form your team using Vaatu. Otherwise, when the fight inevitably gets to the avatar state point, you don't have any capacity to fight against it. So Vaatu feels like you have to lock in for one, meaning you have to build the rest of your team for 4 from the rest. And to me, I do like the ability of having kind of Amon and Tarlok on the team, just because, like I said, they probably get you to avatar state straight away, and avoid a long protracted fight against the skilled avatar already before you even get to the avatar state version of the fight. So I kind of theoretically probably want to go as powerful as possible. So Vaatu, Amon, Unalaq to me probably seems like one of the best teams. Again, it is very waterbending focused, but I like the idea here, because what you can do here is Amon, obviously, once he gets in range, can just take control of the avatar. You theoretically either win the fight there or cause the avatar to go into the avatar state. Then Vaatu becomes really, really important, because the idea is that typically an avatar in the avatar state is more powerful than either Rava or Vaatu, but Vaatu has people on his side to empower. Vaatu can fly through Unalaq and Amon and give them a temporary power boost. He can jump inside one of them for at least a few seconds to give them a power boost. Again, unless harmonic convergence is here, you are not getting a full-on dark avatar, but there's the teamwork of Unalaq and Vaatu is obviously a good combination. And then you do wonder what would happen. Vaatu empowering Amon's bloodbending. Would that allow Amon to bloodbend an avatar in the avatar state? I'm assuming it would work as long as Vaatu is inside Amon, but if it's just a quick power boost, it would last for only a second or two. But maybe that's enough. And again, it's one of the few things that you can actually theoretically consider as being, yeah, that would probably like do something to the avatar in the avatar state. Otherwise, I think you have to just think about that stage of the fight. who can Vatu boost of the other characters to get to that level? And I'm kind of thinking like Vatu boosting Zahir, of course, I guess would like increase his speed, his airbending would be better. But would it be so much better that it would win the fight? Because you're thinking more about firepower at this point, and I don't quite think so. So Vatu empowering Ozai feels like, yes, that's super, super powerful. Probably the same for Azula. That would be quite good. Vatu empowering Kuvira would be interesting to see, like metal bending, and especially what avatar they're going up against. Having a metal bender on the team, especially if you're going up against an avatar who doesn't have metal bending, could be interesting with the whole lockdown ability, and that they would have to theoretically use some avatar state level power to maybe rip bits of metal off themselves if Kuvira succeeds at hitting the avatar. So there are options here for sure, but I think all of them kind of, if you want to win, have to include Vatu. Otherwise, we're not fighting the same fight here. It is my point. Like I said, mine would probably be Vatu Amon Unalaq. Vatu Tarlok, and the problem here is like I wish I had one more to be like Vatu Tarlok and then someone else, but we don't quite have that, and I don't really think any of these are exactly what I want, because Vatu Tarlok is a here feels like it doesn't quite have the firepower in that. Sure, like we're kind of almost discounting and ignoring the fact that Vatu has abilities himself, and that he has the tendrils that can lock down the avatar as well, which is interesting because it has a different form of being in that, like, there's multiple tendrils on Vatu. That's different than the avatar in like a human form with Rava inside. Vatu also opens the door to sort of win the fight in a more technical sense, in that Vatu is the only being on the list who would be able to rip Rava out of the avatar and sort of win the fight that way by effectively, if you in a way lock down the avatar for a certain amount of time, Vatu comes in, rips Rava out, someone hits Rava, that damage is effectively sort of the same as doing damage to the avatar in the avatar state, basically. So if you can separate those two, it feels like, you know, that's a good thing to do in the fight, as we saw, of course. So that's another thing Vatu allows you. And then don't forget, he has his Spirit Beam, which is going to be useful to just blast people away. And especially if you have maybe a few more lightweight characters, that is going to take them out of the fight for potentially a long period of time. I don't think there's going to be that many characters who can take too many hits from Vatu's beam, of course. So that's interesting just by itself. Vatu being there would also affect spirits in the vicinity. Now, we're not necessarily bringing that into play, but it is something to sort of note that Vatu's presence alone, theoretically, has that influence on Rava that kind of affects the kind of balance of power between the two of them. So that's interesting. But I think the main takeaway here is just that, yeah, Vatu is essential to win this fight in a way that is reasonable when discussing this. In a way that is not some very constructed way in which your specific team wins. In that, like, the problem is, like, again, Zahir Azula, which is what a lot of people picked. As you can see here, thankfully, a few people have seen sense. You know, how is Vatu only one? 5 Vatus is the ultimate one, of course. But a lot of people going for Azula Zahir. Zahir and Azula. Zahir and Azula. Azula and Zahir. Zahir plus Azula. Finally, someone brings Amon into play. Amon and Zahir. That's somewhat interesting. But you'll notice, everyone is like, Zahir, Zahir, Zahir. Why is Zahir only 2 books? That's my kind of thing in all of this. It just kind of feels like, I think there are teams that can use Zahir effectively, but he is by no means one of my top, like, picks in this. He's not one of the lowest picks either. I think he's very much middle of the road, and I think he's correctly positioned. But, like, I'm almost like, what way are you interpreting this character where, like, he's going to be your MVP in this fight? And I'm guessing it's just people forgetting a lot of the context behind the Zahir Korra fight at the end of book 3. And that it is not really a good representation of, like, a a character fighting the avatar in the avatar state. Because again, we're not having a whole setup of Korra being captured by his team and being poisoned and all this sort of stuff. That's not in play here. So they're my thoughts, I think, ultimately on this. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. What would your team be? What is your kind of logical analysis of this? What way would you approach doing this? Obviously, myself, I very much focused on the idea of like, Avatar has access to the Avatar state. We ultimately are going to have to deal with that. No, regardless of anything, that's what we're going to have to deal with. Avatar state. And so the whole team, for me, sort of has to be constructed around that side of things. Because yes, it is somewhat easy to make a team of characters here who could defeat an avatar not using the Avatar state. That makes complete sense. There's examples of that on the board, just it kind of in a way individually in specific moments. So a team worth 5 here, absolutely you can create one that can defeat an avatar not using the Avatar state. But it's, can you do it the other way around? And I think that's where you have to be a bit more strategic, and ignoring Vaatu like so many people seems to have, it's just not the pathway for me. But they're my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are below. Otherwise, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.